Very warm welcome, everyone, here at Brasenose College who are in the room, and also a very, very warm welcome to all our participants who are participating online. We had this morning 100 registered online, so we are very pleased and hope that at least more than half of those registered are participating with us today. Before we get started, I wanted just to mention that this is a public event and it's open to everyone, and it's also being recorded so that everyone is aware of that before we move ahead with the substance. I also wanted to use this opportunity to acknowledge that we do this together with our Challenges Forum's UK partner, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, and together with Oxford University. So large thank you for joining up with us to do this event today. I also wanted to thank other partners. We have over 12 registered partners from Challenges Forum who are online with us today. So a warm welcome and thank you for you participating as well. And to other key stakeholders from the African Union and from the United Nations who are also joining us online. And just before we start, I wanted to say, if you are curious about the Challenges Forum, it's very easy. You just go online, www.challengesforum.org or Challenges Forum, any social media, and you will find a lot of information on what we do. So with me here today, I have 5 panelists who are here around the table and 1 panelist from New York on the screen. As the time is short, I will apologize in advance for not bringing a lot of data on our panelists to you today, for those of you who do not already know them, but we have bios of all of our panelists and it will be available together with the recording and other information after the event. So they are very, very skilled and they have a vast experience, so it would take very long if I would go through all of it. Also, we would like this event to be as interactive as possible, so please prepare yourself already now for your short and sharp questions. If you are in the room, you can just raise your hand, and if you are online, you can write your question in a question and answer session. The reason also why we are here just today at this specific occasion is that we are presenting the joint research brief. What is the state of the state when UN Peacekeeping Operation leaves, which is a joint project series. We have more research brief coming out later between the Folke Bernadotte Academy, the Swedish Defence University and Challenges Forum. So basically, we are here gathered today to discuss the topic of this report, but I would say also beyond, because the research that has been done is much larger than what fits in this policy or a research brief. So I'm very much looking forward to learning more about transition and what has been collectively received by all the researchers and practitioners around the table. So I would suggest that we start with a helicopter perspective. We will invite Professor Andrea Ruggeri, who is the author of this report, together with Maline Meiske, to give us some of the information that he has gathered. Andrea has a vast experience. He's a professor here at the University of Oxford, and he is an expert, at least not in data-driven quantitative research on peace operations. So my question to you, Andrea, and it's a very easy one, is how could insight by your research assist the UN field missions to navigate the transition processes better based on your data analysis? Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming here and joining online. And thank you to Challenges Forum. So in a few minutes, I'm going to try to address this, as you say, simple question. I have to, however, say something about why I'm going to say 3 major points. And the why is based on some empirical findings. Some empirical findings based on an analysis of 16 operations, and is a statistical analysis, but is descriptive analysis. So we're not implying causal effect. This is an important point, because actually in this broader project with Professor Kaplan and also John Gledhill and other colleagues, we are triangulating different empirics. So what do we find? We find that if we look at 4 macro areas of state building, governance, health and education, economy and security, when peace operations are deployed, we tend to have an improvement of these macro areas. However, when peace operations leave, we have some sobering results. So in the best case, what has been gained remains stable and we don't have a decay of these indicators, but several indicators actually decline after 1, 2, 3, 5 years after they leave the missions. So I think this is an important findings and is, again, just some tendencies, some trends, but we need to think about why this is happening, why there is now an improvement and consolidation on these 4 macro areas. So again, these are very diverse and heterogeneous findings. So every mission is different. And this is actually a very important point that I will make in the next minute. So I think, going back to your question, there are 3 keywords. One is planning, second is awareness, and third is benchmarking. So first, exit, leaving, transition is a step of a process, cannot be understood as a single event point. It's not just an ending point. So there is necessity of planning, of follow-up arrangement through the United Nations, but also very important with regional initiative and organization and local stakeholders. Why I said awareness? Well, because all peacekeeping operations are different, and so there are different effects on different macro areas of state building. However, I think an important aspect is that it's necessary a systematic assessment on where the country has developed fragilities and dependencies toward the peace operation United Nations in certain area. So it's extremely important to have a systematic assessment on which area and which specific aspect of governance, education, economy, security, the country has developed some fragility and dependency in order to assess the peace operation footprint and therefore then move to the third point, benchmarking. Because a transition that we want to sustain needs a benchmarking process where we can evaluate step by step where these fragilities have developed, which have been the gain and the fruitful outcome of the peace operation, and how you can actually embed in this transition local stakeholders, but also United Nations agency and regional organization. So this is a necessary, therefore, continuing engagement with the local stakeholders. I'm going to stop here because I know I spoke 4 minutes.
It's good that you're keeping more or less to the time. Thank you so much, Andrea. As a non-academic, I would just point out a few things that I heard, and which also goes very well. And now I'm making some promotion again with the Challenges Forum contribution to the new Agenda for Peace. If you hadn't read it, it's also available. So basically, what I hear you saying is that the planning processes must be much better. Transition and end of a peacekeeping operation must be part of a process, not an end game. And there will need to be a systematic assessment during the ways, and we need to have follow-up arrangement. And I think this is a point that is very important, and also for our participants who are with us online, because we have the national dimension, we have the regional dimension where regional organization becomes more important, and we have the international dimension of this. So I think that's a very important takeaways. And now we will move from our helicopter perspective, where we discuss research on a broad base, to a more grassroots level, where we will get some insights on the practical, how this is on the practical field level. So we are going to listen to a video by the special representative of the Secretary General in the DRC, Congo, Bintu Keita, who is also the head of mission for MONUSCO, the UN Peace Operation in the DRC, Congo. So she will give us some practical challenges faced in a transition period. I hope the video will be working well.
I've been told as part of the priority task to prepare a transition plan for the mission in collaboration and cooperation with the agencies, funds and programs in order to showcase that really we are following the instructions from the Security Council, which is to discuss what would be the conditions for the mission to be able to withdraw from the last 3 provinces that are remaining in the DRC. The Security Council was quite prescriptive. They said, okay, with the agency and funds and program, you have to agree on the benchmarks and the indicators for the transition plan. Once you have agreed with the government, please, you have to consult with the civil society organization. And by the way, you also have to consult with all the partners, the donors in particular. And you also have to make sure that you are consulting with the international financial institutions such as World Bank and IMF. I think what was interesting is that we had the first meeting with the agencies, funds and program to try to understand where each one of us were coming in terms of understanding transition. And actually, I realized, and this was scary, everyone has his own idea about what transition meant. And certainly for me, it was not handover of task. Because I've been in other structure and previous assignment where it was all about handing over task, and this was not going well because agencies, funds, and programs are not meant to receive tasks. They have their own mandates and they have their own resources. So anything which is quote unquote handed over is an addition, so it has to come with resources. And there was also this debate about transition for whom? Transition for the mission, transition in the country. And I said, for me, certainly it's both transition for the mission, transition also from the humanitarian, just having humanitarian actors and humanitarian relief, to more development in order to give some stability and foundation for the country to develop and not just responding to symptoms, either through the mission with peace and security, either through the humanitarian relief. And to whom were we transferring, if we were transferring? The end goal being to transfer the responsibilities and accountability to the government in first place, because they are the ones who have to deliver, and we are supporting to deliver that. Because of the various understanding of transition, I called upon the transition team in New York to come and help us to create a common narrative about transition. This worked well. When we developed through the workshop this benchmark, we knew that we needed more time, but we didn't have more time. So we had to say, okay, we have to be satisfied with what we have achieved in short time frame. And then this meant also that when the Security Council endorsed the transition plan and put this into our mandate, our Security Council Resolution 2612, they asked us, every 3 months you have to come with the a report on how you are implementing the transition plan. My biggest lesson is somehow learn to push back on some of the instructions that we are receiving, where everything is based on deadlines, no matter what is happening on the ground. And I think we were looking at meeting the deadlines, and then we missed some of the opportunities to deep dive further into conversations, meaningful conversation on the transition plan.
Yes, I think we got quite a frank account from SRSG Bintu Keita there. I take with me, I mean, what I heard was that it's quite messy, and it's not necessarily always easy to understand which task is handed over to whom, if it's other UN agencies, or as we heard, you can't really hand over the task, but hand over certain aspects of work, and what is really handed over to the host government. And I think that the Challenges Forum has also, in many of our reports, said that the UN must really overcome administrative and organization hurdles to work better together. So I would like to point that out. But we also heard that Bintu Keita was speaking about the support from the UN transitional team, and therefore I'm glad that we have Yasha Shele with us, who is passionate about the work of transition. He is giving us some perspective from the headquarters level on what work and what is done to try to improve the work done for transitions between UN peace operations and other UN entities. So I would like to ask you, Sasha, based on the report that we are discussing today and Andrea and others' research, which is quite sobering in many ways, what is the UN headquarters, both DPO and UNDP, doing to improve transitions in the UN? And is there anything innovative that how this could be, innovative thinking on how this could be done better?
Thank you, Pernilla, and thank you to the Challenges Forum, FCDO, and Oxford University, obviously, for organizing this event. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. It is a privilege to be on the panel with the other speakers. Indeed, I am the manager of the UN Transitions Project, which is an initiative that is trying to make the UN plan and manage transitions in a more proactive, integrated, and forward-looking manner. It is really important because, as I think you've heard from Bintu Keita and also from Andrea, UN transitions are really complex political change management processes that are taking place in very fragile, dynamic context where, unfortunately, a lot of the really important challenges to sustain peace are still on the table. We have, in recent years, been able to put transitions very high on the agenda. That has not always been the case, both internally in the organization and with member states. 2 years ago, in September, we had the first ever standalone resolution on transitions, 2594, which has really given us a legislative framework and which has defined an important shift in transitions and really saying we need to not just focus on exit, but we need to approach transitions as a whole of the organization exercise that is really looking to enhance integration and is really looking at setting up post-mission actors for success. That has not always been the case. Internally, there's also been a directive by the Secretary General that's also expressing really the need for us to plan transitions proactively. And this has also not always been the case. Usually we only react when we get a Security Council resolution telling us to go. So there has been important progress. What we're currently as a project and as the organization working on is now to operationalize these new expectations. Maybe just to highlight a few areas of how that's looking like. UN transitions are taking place often against the backdrop of national transitions, and so are a moment of uncertainty. If we undergo a transition in our strategy, in our footprint, in our configuration, that exacerbates that. So we're trying to work on making transitions more gradual, focusing on enhancing national capacities while the mission is still on the ground. We try to de-link transitions from national elections, and we're trying to build political partnerships that are extending into the post-mission phase. Andrea mentioned benchmarks. It is a key area to right-time these transitions, and benchmarks is an imperfect tool that we have, but the only one or an important one that we have to get this right. So we're working on really articulating more realistic and prioritized benchmarks rather than aspirational sort of end dates that don't really help us determine when the time is right to go. We are working more internally in how do we have more joined up approaches across the system. We can't get a transition right if it's only focused on peacekeeping missions. We have to have the entire system reassess what requires support and really adjust how we work together, building on comparative advantages while a mission is on the ground. I'm almost done, but just to mention national ownership, it is critical and it is really difficult for us to get it right. In some instances, there is weak capacity. In some instances, host governments are party to the ongoing conflict. And so not always do we have a viable partner that we can work with. How we're trying to address that is that we are strengthening national planning capacities for transitions to make sure they speak more to national needs. We're working with partners to enhance government capacity in priority areas, for example, with the World Bank and the DRC, to do a public expenditure review of security institutions to just make them to make clearer what they need to be really on the ground. And in order to what we call, and this is where I'm going to stop for now, to stop the attention cliff, both in terms of political engagement and financial engagement post-mission, we are really trying to enhance strategic coherence, both internally, but also with key partners on what are the key peace-building priorities that require further attention when a mission is leaving, and what are the minimum requirements we need to really achieve to sustain peace. And so here we are really working on building strong partnerships with regional organizations, with IFIs, and sort of influential member states. And we're also trying to better leverage and strengthen existing political and financial instruments in the UN that we have. For example, the Peacebuilding Commission configurations, Group of Friends, the Peacebuilding Fund and its transition window. So we do have a lot of instruments that we're currently trying to bring to bear more in transition settings. Let me leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jascha, and thank you for bringing us back on a little bit of a positive note as well, because it can sometimes be easy to be gloomy. I just wanted to mention a few things that you said that I think is important, and the challenges Forum think is important. And it's like rather being proactive than being reactive. I think that's a very important thing when it comes to UN's way of working with that. You were also talking about operationalizing the process, and then you talked about gradual transition, which is something that Andrea and his research also point at, and political partnership. And something that we also really advocate for is, of course, that UN should really look at its comparative advantages and work as one UN. I just said it before, but I repeat it again because I think it's important. So now we will go back to more practical experience from UN field operation. We have with us Simon Blatchley today. He has a very long policing career in the UK. And he also have told me that he has a rewarding experience as police commissioner in UNMIL, which is the UN Peacekeeping Operation in Liberia, or was the UN Peacekeeping Operation in Liberia. He has also been a senior police advisor in Iraq, and he has worked on with the policing issues at the UN headquarters in New York. So I'm going to ask you also a question. When you look at the future, do you believe that the police component could get an increased role in the transition process, in particularly in sustaining capacity building and protection of civilians? And I don't want you to just say, and yes, I want you to explain a bit how.
I was going to go, yes.
Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation today. I'll focus more on policing because that's my expertise. One comment I will say, the SRSG made a comment about the interference from UNHQ, and I have to say we used to joke about the 6,000-mile long screwdriver from the headquarters that used to come in. So you do need that clear mandate. As to the role of policing and UN police specifically, yes, I do believe there is a great role for UN policing that isn't necessarily used all the time. When I was police commissioner in Liberia, you sometimes got that friction between the military and the police, but there's a clear mandate for both roles, but it needs to be clear what the military responsibility is and what the police responsibility is. Sometimes that gets confusing, and I think errors can be made when you start asking soldiers and military to carry out policing operations if you're looking at operations internally, be it organised crime or protection of civilians, which is more sort of civilian focused. I've seen mistakes when I've been out and about when I was working at New York and inspector missions, where you use military to train police officers. It is a different role. So you do need to get that balance, in my view, between the role of military, role of police, but also be absolutely clear what it is you want your United Nations police to achieve. It's a clear mandate, as has already been said. And you also need to make sure you have the right skills within that UN component, within that policing component, to develop, mentor and train. Liberia is probably a good example, because there was this transition between when the UN police were actually carrying out the policing function from the nation to then being handed on to the Inspector General of Police in Liberia, which is when I took over, and I was mentoring the IGP into that transition place. But there was still that cliff edge between massive reduction in UNPOL. But the last 6 months, there were about 500 of us I was in command of. But the moment we finished in April 18, it went down to 3. So there's an awful lot of support that is then immediately withdrawn, and the UN country team didn't at that point really have the capacity to give the same level of support. The other issue we faced with the transition was, of course, we managed through the election process. So during that Liberian election, the new president came in, and because most of the senior appointments in Liberia are political appointees, there was then a new head of police, new head of immigration, new head of drug enforcement agency, which then means that I had 3 months to try and support and mentor them as they moved into their roles. So I genuinely think the UN police do have a role in that transition process. Make sure they have the right skills, and ideally you have that glide path leading down to when you can leave the mission altogether, handing over to the UN country team, working with other member states and embassies as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was just thinking about a conversation we had at FCDO the other day when you're talking about the very, very, very long screwdriver and how that might have been changed by the delegation of authority, but I don't know that. So we will have to come back on that issue. But I think a few important things, which I have, and challenges for, I've also said, and we are saying again in our paper, it's like the building blocks of a UN peace operation should be more flexible, meaning that quite sometimes it's actually policing task rather than military task that is at hand. And yet, until today, UN peace operations are mainly military based and not so much police. So I think that we have work to do on the future on that. I find it also interesting that you pointed out that it's not only, the internal capacity, but it's also the fact that if you want to work very close with national stakeholders, but then these stakeholders change quite rapidly, yes, and all of them at the same time, it becomes also very much harder. And I think that's also something to look into for future discussion on that is, if you have an election and everything change, how do you manage in such a situation? But without any further ado, we are now going to turn to Jessica Di Salvatore, who is an associated professor at the University of Warwick. A lot of her work has focused on UN peace operation and the contribution to state building and post-conflict development. So I would like to ask you a question, Jessica, which is about once the UN peace operation leaves, there is often what's called a funding cliff, and this is often used as an explanation as the drop into the state building of the country. So I wanted to ask you, how could this be avoided, and what role do you see international financial institution having in UN transition processes?
Yeah, I think it's a very pertinent question when we think about transition. And I apologize in advance, I have a bit of a cold, so I try to speak as clearly as possible. So it's, of course, there's something of this that UN has control on, so there's something the UN can manage and do better, but then at the same time, this also requires coordination with international actors, which can be financial institutions, but more generally development actors, but also member states that are donors in many cases in those countries. So when it comes to the side of the story that UN has more control on, if you wish. So basically the funding cliff is not much different than a security cliff, you can imagine. Like when UN has to hand over security responsibilities to the national police, for example. And there are thousands of civilian experts that are sent to this mission. So basically whenever resources are withdrawn from a country, you can expect pretty much any kind of cliff, if you want. Now, what this means, of course, and I think this resonates with things that Andrea has already mentioned, as well as Yasha, that transition to improve in this sense, there needs to be not just gradual, but also monitored in key areas. So there needs to be specific, tailored for the needs of the host country to reduce the risks of the funding cliff, but also more generally other kinds of cliffs that can really jeopardize, if you wish, the state building efforts that might have happened for years. At the same time, there's all this coordination side that needs to be added to the picture. We know that the presence of UN operations does incentivize, attract foreign direct investments, more ODA, so development assistance. It just provides a degree of reassurance that things will be fine for some times. And so we see empirically that just more money comes in. Also money from the UN itself, if you think of the Peacebuilding Fund and all the other related initiatives and all the money that ultimately gets to the countries. Then when the UN leaves, however, there's also this idea that eventually this means that investors won't trust the conditions anymore. They won't feel reassured enough to keeping the money in the country ultimately. So unless, I would say, two conditions apply, unless conditions on the ground have changed, so the UN reassurance is not needed anymore, and there's coordination with other donors. And when it comes to the latter, I think there's a working paper by Eugene Chen that looks at transition and how the risk of financial cliff can be reduced. And he suggests to look indeed at the budget and the thematic areas of the UN budget. So the thematic areas where the UN is mostly spending its budget in a specific countries, and then coordinate with donors, coordinate with member states to make sure that in a way those needs are then addressed. So they can redirect funds, they can redirect ODA, development assistance, in order to fill potential gaps. But of course, this requires more coordination. And I would also like to add on the very idea of the funding cliff that it's of course a reasonable issue to be concerned about, also a sensible one. At the same time, I think, as far as I know, there's not much systematic evidence that the departure itself is causing the funding cliff. So there are sometimes other trends. So, for example, there might be election just before the withdrawal that might actually be the cause of maybe investor losing faith in what's happening in countries and the transition ultimately being disrupted by this. So I think on the one hand, we do need more information to identify the causes of the funding cliff in order to think about better way to inform policymakers, but definitely more coordination and more gradual and monitored transition. I think they definitely they will hurt for sure.
So thank you so much, Professor Di Salvatore. I mean, basically what we heard is that we need more research. So all of you who listen now and are researchers, please, go into this field as well and do some more research. But I also did hear that more needs to be done to try to coordinate donors and to fill gaps. And I will not bore you today, but I was in Kosovo when we had a very big, large UN peace operation there as a Swedish diplomat, and there was a massive amount of donors and very little coordination. So I could tell you side stories at another time about that. But I think that definitely, and you also a gradual and monitored situation you also pointed out. So I think this is a very important fund. And I mean, I hope that you all now are planning for your question, because soon we are going to be entering into the question and answer section. So please prepare your question to the speakers you've heard so far. And last but in no way least, I welcome Professor Richard Kaplan, who is working here at the University of Oxford. He has written very many books, and he is also in charge of the After Exit project, which is actually looking into consequences of the withdrawal of UN peacekeeping operations. So a vast knowledge of sitting here with the other professors around the table. So I wanted to ask a question. We often hear that peace operation needs to be mindful of spoilers and intervention dilemmas, and sometimes there's talks about the peacekeeping trap. So I wanted to ask you, how could UN peacekeeping operation avoid unintentionally impeding incentive of national ownership, and especially when it comes to state building and economical development?
Great.
Well, thank you again for organizing this forum. I do want to pick up on one interesting and important point I think that you made earlier, Pernilla, and that is that while we are focused on the challenges and the weaknesses, we've made a lot of progress, I think. I've been following these issues now for really a decade, and a lot of what was new and almost aspirational in terms of thinking and practice, I think, has been now incorporated into the UN system and more widely. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there's not more work to be done, and that's one of the reasons why, of course, we're here today. But I think that we have made quite a lot of progress. The peacekeeping trap, I'll start with that. If by that you mean dependence of host states on peacekeeping operations, yes, that can be a problem. And indeed, as Andrea and Maline's very interesting research has shown, there can be a deterioration of conditions when the UN leaves. It can be for various reasons. And that's why another aspect of the work that we've been doing has been a very close examination of particular cases. You need to have that alongside the broad statistical analysis that we've been doing. And with regard to some of those cases, yes, we have found that the departure has been associated with the deterioration of conditions because indeed there has been a dependence, thinking about Liberia going back to 97, Timor-Leste 2005, Haiti 2017. I think that they're very close associations. Now, what can be done to mitigate this dependency? 4 points, and some of which we've heard really already, so I'll be echoing what some of my colleagues have said. The first is better diagnosis, careful analysis of the capabilities and vulnerabilities of the host country and the capacity of the UN to address those vulnerabilities. Now, there is good practice, fortunately. Again, we've talked a lot about Liberia. I think Liberia does offer some very significant good practice. There were various capacity mapping exercises that were conducted in Liberia prior to the closure of the mission there, exercises mapping the capacity of both the country, but also the UN and the fitness of the UN and the success of the UN country team to be able to address those capacities, to be able to assist Liberia. But second, having identified vulnerabilities, we need, of course, effective capacity building. We need this all along, not obviously only at a time of transition. But this is a lot easier said than done. I mean, Yasha's already alluded to this. It requires time, requires resources, requires a willingness also on the part of the host government. And when I say time, think back to the World Development Report 2011, and if you can remember that, those timescales for how much less challenged countries, I'm not talking about conflict-affected countries, but less challenged countries, how much time they needed to eliminate, for instance, corruption, to establish rule of law. And now we're talking about countries that are, if you will, doubly cursed. They've both been, they're fragile development challenges, but at the same time have experienced war. The third point, we've heard a little bit about this as well, but phased withdrawal of peacekeepers has distinct advantages. It allows for a gradual transfer of competences to the national authorities, but it also allows for a monitoring of progress and an adjustment of course along the way. And again, I think we can invoke UNMIL in Liberia positively here. UNMIL incrementally reduced its troop levels over time and eventually transferred responsibility to the Liberian forces before they left. 2 years before they left, they stayed to ensure the conditions were satisfactory. And then finally, I'll just mention careful coordination with other partners, especially where there will be successor organizations that are going to be picking up the reins. And we need to not just throw the responsibilities into their laps. There has to be very careful negotiation with them, and also assurance that they have adequate resources available to them to pick up that baton and to carry on with the responsibilities.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaplan. I mean, I think there's a lot of different issues here pointed out. I mean, maybe I should have said, you know, when we talk about the challenges, we have like governance challenges, we have security challenges, and we have economical challenges. So, I mean, these can also vary in different settings, right? So it's important to point that out when you talk about the challenges of a peace operation leaving. I think that one of the most important thing I actually have heard you say here, and it really dawned upon me, because while you were in Liberia and another state, I was in my Liberia in UNMIL myself, arriving in 2009 and leaving finally in 2011. And even when I arrived, we started about the benchmark for downsizing the mission and phasing out. And you can see how long it takes. And it would be interesting maybe later to hear if that kind of span of time is also one of the important issues for the successfulness of a handover. And I mean, what could be like seen if there's anything indicating, you know, a time frame for this, because this is, again, my personal reflection from my own personal experience, but sometimes I feel we are very impatient and we think that things should happen very fast. And it's very hard maybe to have these transitions in a very short time. So it's a reflection from mine, but many very important points. I will not repeat them because I'm wary of time, and I would like us also to be able to go into the question and answer session, because we have people here in the room and we have people online joining us who might very well have their own questions that they want to ask. So I would again say, if you are in the room, please just raise your hand and be ready to ask a question. We have a colleague standing here with a microphone ready to listen to you. And if you are online, you have the Q&A function where you can ask your question. So please introduce yourself and try to be as short and pertinent in your question as possible. And while you are really thinking about your questions, because it normally takes a few minutes, I will ask a general questions to the panel, and then you get ready, right? So we often hear that missions mandate should be limited in scope, and there should be tighter parameters for like measuring success. Sometimes, you know, there's all this talk about the Christmas tree mandates and you know, big scopes, and you know, sometimes we also talk about end goals, or some people talk about exit strategies. I prefer myself end goals rather than exit strategy, and timeframes. So a question that I throw out at you when we wait for the questions from the audience is, should it really be a core task for the UN peacekeeping operation to try to improve host states' capacity for state building, given the long-term and complicated issues with this process? Or should, you know, I'm just explaining, like, or should it be like a peacekeeping operation is deployed to stabilize the situation and that's it? So yeah, the floor is open to anyone in the panel who wants to start. It was a while since you spoke, Andrea. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, this is an extremely difficult question, and I think there is a debate that is a policy debate, but also an academic debate. Also, when Richard, John, Sabrina and Atina, that we're working this project, we were discussing, is really a goal of peace operation to build the state. That's, I think, maybe too demanding. So from my perspective, clearly the first step is the security. And this is something that, and I have to say here, I'm getting a bit critical with the critical approaches in academic analysis, is that, you know, this obsession with the positive peace that is above a negative peace. So the fact that, you know, peace to be peace has to have different aspect of development, institutional integration, maybe can have some limitation. So my point is that you cannot have positive peace without negative peace. If you don't stop the killing, if you don't stop the atrocities, building the states, providing a positive peace is almost impossible. So I know maybe for some of you it's not such a provocative statement. I think for many colleagues, students and scholars is indeed quite a provocation.
Anyone else want to make a comment on this?
So I sorry. Many thoughts on this, as probably everyone researching peacekeeping at the moment. But maybe as a direct reaction to what Andrea said, I think that's in a way brings us back to the discussion about what peacekeeping should look like. But then at the same time, there's also the point of how peacekeeping looks like today. And my impression is that the UN is already doing state building. So whether we should maybe ask if what UN is doing works or not. And I think there are some positive signs on that. I think what Andrea said is right. You do need some conditions on the ground to make sure that positive peace, let's say political development, economic development, can actually start. But then at the same time, how can you make sure that negative peace lasts enough if you don't address other problems that may be the causes, right, of the lack of negative peace? And with negative peace, of course, we mean just the end of violence, but you want to make it durable, like you just want to end it without making sure that then it relapses quite quickly. And in terms of how the UN is faring on the state building, because I mean, it's possible that the UN is doing something good when it tries to do state building. It depends how we define state building, but there's some recent research showing, I've done some of that myself, but showing that the UN can help supporting democratic transitions. It can make peace more inclusive, can reduce political exclusion. So there are some positive news. I think we lack a little bit of knowledge on how citizens perceive the state that the UN is building, right? So to what extent a state building process that is basically externally led is undermined by the very fact that it's not a domestic process. So how does this affect trust the citizens have toward institutions, their willingness to participate to elections or the political life of their own countries? I think this is still a little bit open as a problem for us.
Yeah, it brings us a bit to the importance of, since the Brahimi report, local ownership. But I will not now. I mean, I could hijack the whole process, and I don't want to do that. But I see here in the front we have questions, and then one a little bit further in the back. So let's. There are two of them, so they can decide among themselves.
Hi, Andrew Johnson. I'm asking a question of capacity, obviously. Is there any sense of kind of what kind of leadership qualities are needed? And if you have any thoughts on the impact of delegated authority, very welcome to have those.
Just hang on, just to make sure that I understood your question, right? So basically you are questioning what skills that are needed for managing the transition. And we have like internal UN skills, we have like skills to technically wind down a mission, and we have skills to actually hand over to national authorities. All right, we'll take the next question.
Thank you. My name is Maline, I'm also from the Foreign Office. I wonder if you could say if you have any reflections on the nature of the impetus, the trigger for transition, where that comes from, and the impact that has on whether the transition can be successful. And it's not too far of a reach, whether there's anything to be said about the stimulus for launching the peacekeeping operation in the first place, whether that's the different stimulus for it, or the ambition of the peacekeeping operation also affects ability to deliver successful.
So basically your question is about the stimulus of starting a mission as well as transiting a mission, both of them, or how should I?
Yeah, no, I would say, I mean, I want to keep the question short because I know time is short, but I would say, in Liberia, you had a host government and a council that both wanted transitions over time for scientific reasons. In Georgia, you had a member of the Security Council that said no more. So you have different. The trigger that causes the beginning of transition can be very different.
Yeah.
What difference does that have on whether transition can be successful? But if it's not too ambitious, what about the trigger that started the peacekeeping operation in the first place and the scope for which that peacekeeping operation was established, whether that can also affect the successful transition later down.
All right, we take one more question from down there, and then we will have answers before we go to a second round of questions.
Thank you so much for the panel, for a very interesting discussion. I would like to ask a question about the role of small states. As we know,
what's your name?
Sorry, my name is Diana Galeva. I'm visiting fellow at Oxford University. We know that small states normally they apply self-power strategies, mediation efforts, or peace building efforts. But within the context of peacekeeping operations of living that period, what's the role of small states? And for example, during in the small states forum on the UN agenda, what role they play, and what are the opportunities for these countries? For example, you mentioned about foreign aid opportunities. Can you give any other examples for that? Thank you so much.
So I actually think part of the first question about the skills needed, I would like to maybe direct towards Yasha, who is leading the transitional team in New York. Yasha, over to you for a first answer.
Sure, thank you. I also, just to note that Kevin Kennedy, a colleague, is also wanted to come in. I don't know whether with questions or answers on this, but maybe let me kick it off. I think there, as I said at the outset, right? These are really complex change management processes. So I think you do need a broad stroke of skills, right? I think it's really important. I think to also SRSG's Keita's point, you really need to engage at a political level. You need to push back on timelines many times when it comes to transitions, and you need to create a really strong narrative about what a transition means in a given context. Transitions are very context specific, and really depend on, you know, what do we have, what was the conflict in the first place, what's the degree of how we solved it, what's our relationship with the host government, to the point of one of the questions. What is our setup? So you really need to articulate a narrative of what a reasonable transition does look like in a specific country. So you need to have that political acumen. You need to have good negotiation skills on the one hand. Then you need to be you need to lead change internally, right? You need to have colleagues on the ground, your staff, to change the way that they're doing business, recognizing that there is an end to a peacekeeping mission eventually, and how can we work in a different manner to take that into account, right? It's not startup, implementation, and then drawdown, but it's continually adjusting how we work. You need to deal with resistance. You need to change mindsets. So that's another skill set. And I think then you need to have very good knowledge of UN systems and processes in order to really leverage the tools that you have to create more joined up approaches, right? To the point of really finding additional resources at a time when, just by the drawdown of a peacekeeping mission, there is a huge drop in resources and support on the ground, right? Even if you don't talk about sort of an increase of ODA, just the fact of pulling out a UNAMID out of Darfur, which used to be a $1 billion mission, is a huge drop in sort of capacity, right? And so I think you need to be very skillful and knowledgeable about sort of system internal mechanisms and resources as well. Let me leave it there.
Thank you so much, Yasha. I think it is
just the microphone.
we're okay.
Yeah, sorry about it.
It's okay. Sorry for those of you online. There was some kind of technical issue here at place. Yeah, I think it's a very, very hard task, but I think it is important to actually think about, you know, and I think that, you know, Professor Kaplan said something important, though, that we have come some way from where we were before, because sometimes it's hard to remember where you were before when you are not really happy where you are today. But I think probably, as Yasha was also alluding to, there is a huge amount of skills needed, and maybe even more needs to be done to actually look at this of these things, how you actually do a proper transit. And it's I think we all heard that from Bintu's video, that it was too much also put on one person just to try to manage all that at the same time as you have maybe a political and a security crisis in the country where you're deployed.
Can I have a comment to that?
Yeah.
Just to add to that point, from my experience, the SRSG, the head of the UN, cannot do everything. They need all the skills that have just been mentioned. They need a strong leadership team around them. So the transition, a very good director of mission support to do all these sort of detailed, complex logistical sides. So it is that joint team effect. And one of the impacts I've seen on the transition is when inevitably when a mission draws down, people choose to move to other missions, particularly if they've got a long-term UN employee. So as well as that continuity within the sort of the host nation, I personally think it's important there's continuity within that UN mission as well, that senior leadership team. The SRSG cannot do everything. So you need that sort of joint approach from everybody. And ideally, and again in Liberia, one of the deputies actually remained in mission as the head of the country team. And I felt that really worked well for that transition process, that understanding.
And that is actually quite a unique situation. So maybe that leads us into the second question, which actually taps into the exit project and the new data I think that you do have. I mean, I think discussing when to decide when to start a mission is obviously very much up to the Security Council and the members of the Security Council to decide on a peace operation. And it could be all kinds of reasons for that. Sometimes I don't know. I mean, like, it's not like every crisis in the world get discussed of having a peacekeeping operation. So, yeah, I mean, we can discuss that at length, but I think it would be interesting to turn towards this side of the table and hear a bit about, the data from, what triggers transition and how it works. And because I know that you have new data on Liberia, Haiti and Cote d'Ivoire. So if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Maybe I could say something, and this is in response to the question about at least the impetus for termination. It is very variable, and sometimes it rises from within the host country itself. I'm thinking about Chad, when Chad decided enough is enough. We'd like you out tomorrow, please. I mean, not that quickly, but not much later than that, as it happens. It may be that particular member states, influential member states, they might be from troop contributing countries, they might be Security Council members who are pushing for a termination of mission for particular reasons. Either they may feel that we've achieved all that we need to or all that we can, and that there are other crises that require attention. There may be, if I may say, even parochial, if I could call it that, national interests, whereby particular member states wish to see maybe countries where they have other interests getting attention, and they recognize that there's a limit in the amount of resource that's available. And I think that, but then there are also many cases where it's been deemed that we have met many of our goals, that the situation here is sustainable. And that's really important. And I think it is really important to work back from the requirements for sustainability in the country. And so it's thought that this is or will be soon an appropriate time to leave. So the impetus, I think, for leaving is very variable. And I think it very definitely has an impact on the nature and maybe even the effectiveness of the transition. I know that's only answering half your question, but I think that's important to bear in mind.
I just, I think Mal has a very important point, that from actually a research point of view, but I think also as analysts, we shall not forget that the peace operation is there for certain reasons. And those reasons could have been affecting the dynamics of the peace process. However, it's true that many new endogenous aspects that can related to new elections. It can be related to actually change in leadership that is from the local, but also regional, can really create new dynamics that can influence then the possibility of exit. So I think it's a crucial point that first, as you said, I mean, we are actually in this moment in one of the peak of civil wars. That is quasi almost similar to the 90s, but only one out of 3 civil wars is discussed on average in the Security Council, and only 1 out of 2 they have a peace operation. And we don't have a new peace operation. I'm not talking about political mission, but peace operation since 2014. We are arriving to almost 10 years of absence of a new peace operation. So I think it's extremely important that we have really a pragmatic approach and think about the stimulus and trigger of peace operation. First, because it's 10 years, we don't do any new one. And yet we know there are actually very useful tools. And second, let's not forget that there are dynamics and process during the deployment that can also influence the trajectory of the exit.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's interesting also to think about this thing, because these issues probably also do affect the transition and of a mission. I mean, what came to mind now when we were talking were like 2 different cases, like Burundi and Haiti, where you have internal. I mean, you will have an internal pressure to close a mission or an external pressure to reopen a mission. So there are all those kind of dynamics as well existing. So I'm encouraging all researchers to look further into this issue, because obviously more needs to be done. We also had a question about small state and soft power. Yasha, you want to say something more on this? Over to you.
I wanted to come in, but actually more a little bit sort of going back to the question that you actually posed at the beginning about sort of the mandates of peacekeeping and whether there should be state building in the mandate. And I feel like
very little.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, please just be brief, please.
Yeah, I just think it's for us from a practitioner's point of view, it's not a luxury that really we have in that we cannot build sort of security capacity. I think this was also to the point of how sometimes the states that we're building are seen, right? We cannot build security capacity without really looking at sort of the governance around these security actors, right? And if there are sort of really triggers of conflict is lack of access to justice or lack of rule of law, if it is sort of limited civilian oversight of security institutions, as we've just seen in Sudan, right? It's kind of, for us, it's not something that we can sort of choose one or the other. I think what we do need to do instead is we really need to focus on the division of labor that we have in how we sort of ensure sort of better governance. And I think one really important thing that we see is a lot of times the peace building challenges on the table are of political nature. They're not necessarily due to a lack of capacity. There is obviously also the capacity aspect, but many times the systems in countries in which we operate are because some people really benefit from these systems the way that they are, right? So I think we really need to get better at understanding the political economies that drive states to be the way that they are, and then think about how at the political level we can change incentive structures for those political economies to change, and then sort of complement that with technical capacity building. I think those two need to go hand in hand, and there's a critical role for peacekeeping missions to work on that, I think.
Magic of the microphone. Thank you, Yasha. We had a question about small states. I don't know if anyone has any answer, comment on that.
Yeah, maybe I can
quickly. Yeah,
I can absolutely very quickly. Well, there's a role for small states, of course, because it's not just a matter of how much you contribute, for example, in terms of troops. There's a lot of civilian expertise that is also needed in these missions. And maybe to link to Yasha's points, the political willingness to, for example, implement reform or build capacity or do something related to institution building, oftentimes may require some small states may have the ability to support these kind of processes. The dialogue that needs to be basically host state consent that continuously needs to be renewed, renegotiated. It's always something that can, from one day to another, that can be just not there anymore. It can be because of elections or for other reasons. And I think there's a lot of role in terms of the diplomatic action that some states can play, especially if they're perceived as external players. Like, just keep it super short.
I'm looking at my colleague to see if we have received any question from the audience online, but we have not. But I know that we have some more questions here on the role. And I mean, actually, I saw a question here before and a question there as well before we took the other 3 questions. But let's take 3 questions. Can we? How do we do this without a microphone? You just speak out loudly. Maybe you start. Well, they told us not to use
down the sound on the mic though, so they speak the mic.
No, we can use the
Or
mic.
they can come closer.
We can use the mic.
Yes, but
We can use the mic, please. So
we took an executive decision to use the mic. So first here in the front row.
Use mic inside, please. I'm John Bertel. I'm part of the after exit team here at Oxford. Particularly Yasha, you use the term attention flip. That's not a term that I've heard before. It's very interesting to hear it, but we are familiar with the idea that when missions close, former host countries do sort of fall into abeyance in terms of the Security Council agenda, progress reports stop, and so there isn't the same kind of political attention. So I think it's really important to use this term. In terms of what can be done about it, there's the work of your team, there's the work that we're doing in terms of trying to draw academic attention to this. There's the work of the Peacekeeping Commission. And so there are actors that are trying to keep attention on former host states. But I guess my question to you is what can be done about challenges of political will? Because at the Security Council level, with a country like Haiti, for example, there's certainly plenty of attention on the horrendous situation in Haiti, but there hasn't yet been the political will to take steps in order to really address that. When it comes to, for example, a country like Liberia, there has actually been a lot of political will from the Liberian government to maintain attention on the Liberian case, and so they've been working actively with this commission. And so I think when you do see political will from domestic actors, perhaps you will see reduction in attention deficit, but then there's this challenge of attention deficit and political will at the level of the Security Council. So, you know, what can we do about political will? Really big question.
I saw also a question further down there. Yes, exactly, over there.
Hello, thank you for this very interesting discussion. And I was a Davis legal student here at the University of Oxford. I wanted to ask, trace back to the other kind of war that we've been talking about. It's the narrative war, because we kind of take for granted that during a transition, democracy and the rule of law are these two prioritized principles that we have to be basing every single decision on when it comes to Statebuilding, and are the keys to a successful transition at the end of the day. But many societies have constructed this vision or this notion around these principles, this evil imposed principles from a global north order that they don't necessarily like. So my question there is, how do we do state building without necessarily shoving down these principles down the throat of countries that maybe aren't too friendly towards them, in a way that we enable spoilers or foreign actors from capturing state power.
And we take a last question as well from this side.
I was just wondering, and how long is peacekeeping and state building kind of negotiated in light of like countries where there's a proliferation of weapons and like multiple regional like players?
All right, 3 very simple questions to answer. So actually, I allow myself to decide the order here. So I actually would like us to start with the middle question, like how do we see state UN peacekeeping operation and state building when not everybody maybe agree on the definitions of democracy and rule of law? Professor Kaplan, what did you say?
Well, the premise fundamentally, I think, is correct, which is to say that if there isn't buy-in, it's ultimately going to be extremely difficult to succeed. There has to be a sense of common purpose. But maybe I question the extent to which there is a lot of contention between host states and the UN. I think where it encroaches often on personal interests, there I think you often may have a problem. So is there really, for instance, a serious objection to human rights as, say, broadly accepted in the international system, the human rights regime? Or is there an objection to the introduction and position of particular rights because somebody's thinking through how is this going to affect me, impunity, corruption, maybe even respect for minorities when I have a constituency that I represent and I'm vulnerable as major political figure if I'm going to be making too many concessions. So I think you mentioned the word narrative, and I think that is really important. I think it's a very interesting question, and I think that it would be worth looking case by case. Here's maybe an opportunity for a second doctorate when you finish the one you're doing now.
Thank you so much. I actually will then let Yasha in because you are not in the room, Yasha, and we soon have to wrap up. So I'll give you the chance to answer the question that was directed towards you. Over to you.
The one about sort of political will, right?
Yeah.
If I recall correctly. Yeah. Look, I think for us, and I will by no means pretend to have a silver bullet on this one, but we are keenly aware that when sort of the narrative of transition enters a conversation, that our leverage with host governments is usually reduced, right? Because there is a sense that our our strength out of our political Chapter 7 support through the Security Council is being replaced by a less robust UN setup. So I think what is really important for us, if we want to sustain space for political reforms to continue, for work on sort of sensitive peacebuilding issues to continue, is that we have a good sense of who are really now the actors that really have more leverage in sort of nudging these processes forward. And the SRSG said, as soon as now that the mission is basically asked to leave, it is a lot harder for her to get traction with the host government. The World Bank, who obviously then is coming in and has huge funding envelopes, is, however, getting a lot of audiences and a lot more play. So I think thinking about it from that perspective and then converging the thinking with these actors who maybe don't sufficiently have a conflict lens sometimes onto their engagement in post-conflict context. They have increasingly so, but I think sort of bringing the convergence around what do we jointly need to focus on and where do we need to sustain engagement, I think is for us the avenue that we are currently looking in order to continue with reform processes.
Thank you so much. And then we had another quite simple question on how we deal with peacekeeping operation and state building in areas where you have proliferation of weapons. Do you want?
I don't know if the constable wants to.
Do you want the constable to answer that?
Sorry, the question again.
Maybe you want to repeat your question?
I was just wondering how state building and peacekeeping are kind of negotiated in countries where there's a lot of weapon proliferation and multiple regional, key regional and national goods.
In 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes. Sorry, I don't have that level of experience to understand how that's done. The conflicts I've seen there when I was working in Iraq in particular with that and it is just incredibly hard to actually balance the two. I'm not sure I can actually speak about it with any sort of knowledge or experience. to be honest.
Can I just jump in here? And I think that, so for instance, DDR, so demobilization, demilitarization, integration process are very important. However, like the field candidate here, Anna Vernick, is working on, also funded thanks to the Fort Bernadotte Academy. Actually, there is not a unidirectional policy, because under certain condition, actually taking weapons away from local actors indeed can help the reform of the security, but can also escalate tension because there is not a sense of rule of law and security and protection. So again, it depends. It depends what is the specific context, and hopefully Anna, in a couple of years, will have finished her research, thanks to survey and analysis, and tell us under what condition and what are the best policy for DDR policies.
We are really looking forward to that, Professor Kaplan.
Briefly, because you mentioned also the regional dimension, and I think that that's really important, that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that these are not problems that are confined to borders. And you think about even Eastern DRC with Rwanda, Uganda, and also in the past, not that distant past, Sierra Leone, Liberia, these problems spill over. So you can't always think that you can address them in even just the country that's hosting the peace operation. You have to be able to take a regional approach sometimes.
It is really a very important point, I think, because both peace operations are in all cases national, and most UN country team also work nationally. So that it does create a complication. Now, UN has tried to curb some of that by establishing regional offices, but still, I think it is a problem. So thank you for pointing that out. I saw a lot of hands up here that hasn't had a chance to ask the question and get the answers. The good news is that when we finish here, there is coffee behind there, and all of us will be around. So please just try to grab us around the coffee and ask your questions. So that's the privilege you have being here in the room, because now we really will have to wrap up this session. So I would like just to do a very, very brief tour around the table and say, in 3 sentences, how could UN peace operation improve the transition process? And I will start with you, Professor Kaplan.
Well, maybe echoing what I had said earlier, and one of the themes of this report, I think one very important question is, do we have the diagnostic capacity that we need? Is it fit purpose? We need to have adequate diagnostic capacity to assess a host state's preparedness for transition. And so I think that we need to be directing more attention in this particular area.
So the right diagnostics and the right knowledge about the host state capacity. I hand over to you, Commissioner Blackley.
Building on what's been said, with that, it's then the right mandate and the right tasks to the different components of the mission about what is to be achieved within that, actually clear directions when what needs to be done. And also, I'll come back to the point, the right people. I can't emphasize enough that you need the right people in the right roles to actually achieve this, be it working with the country team, working with the member states to actually achieve this. You can have the strategies and academic research as you like. If you don't have the right people on the ground, I'd encourage people to get involved actually in the ground. It won't work.
And Professor?
Again, building on what has been already said and what we have been discussing so far, I think we seem to all agree on a gradual and monitored transition, but also coordination, right, with other actors in terms of what comes next. Is the UN going to send political missions, or just handing over to others like bank or other international actors that can help smoothing the transition a little bit? And maybe one more challenge that I think came up but we didn't have time to discuss is what happens when the transition is sort of pushed back by the host state, when you don't have the time to do the gradual monitoring and
like
all
the Burundi case.
Exactly, like you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So I guess that these are other cases that would require other kind of solutions.
Yeah, it's an important point. You have a transition that you can control because you have a control over the process, and you have transition that are forced upon you. And maybe then you want to add your 3 sentences, Sasha. Jasha, sorry.
No worries. 3 sentences. I think one, it's not peacekeeping transition, it's UN transition. I think that's really important. It's not just the responsibility of the peacekeeping mission to get this right. Second, we really need strong political strategies and frameworks because these are mostly political challenges. So to get them right, we need strong political strategies. We need to overcome silos on the UN side, but also on the member state side, because sometimes what we are getting as directions from the Security Council is not matched by priorities from donors. So there's often a disconnect there. And then a little bit more internally, we really need to fully anchor transition planning into UN planning processes, and recognizing that often people don't know what's happening next week. I think we do need to have additional capacity to really do long-term planning, to do the diagnosis that Robert has talked about, because really, and I think, let me close there. Richard Gowan, the crisis group director at the UN, said, how we draw a line on the missions like MONUSCO or MINUSMA is going to be one of the biggest political and ethical challenges that the Security Council is going to face in the coming years. The transitions that we have supported in the past are so paling in complexity with some of the upcoming ones. So we really do need all hands on deck in order to get this right.
Thank you, Yasha. And then that brings us to the exit project and a lot of work that's done. And I remind again that we are here today to discuss the report, but more. And for you who doesn't have the physical version, there is a QR code around the room, and there is easily places where you can find the report. So please, if you don't have it, get it. And that leads me to you and Professor Ruggeri to say a few sentences at the end.
Just to conclude and try to be actually pragmatic on a certain specific policy, I mentioned that 3 points are very important: planning, awareness, and benchmarking. All this is not possible if you don't have data and facts. However, one of the problems is that the staff of the mission tend to be actually overcommitted in many duties. So asking them to collect further facts and further events and data actually is not feasible. Or if we do it, and this comes from my experience working with some data analysis for A4P+, and also related to digital strategy of the UN. And if you do it, and they are actually overcommitted on other duties, the data they will collect are not good enough. So clearly, we have to develop, and I'm talking also to member states. I'm happy that Foreign Office is here. I'm happy that also the FDA is here. We have to support the UN in order to develop specific figures that they are deployed and trained in peace operation, able to collect and analyze data. This is not just a researcher bias, it is a necessity in order to plan the activity and also assess different dimensions. And as the special representative says, if we cannot provide support of new staff with new skills, they will push back, and they will do it rightly so. But we know that this is a situation where we need better data, better trained social scientists that can be developed and deployed in the mission, but also sharing data between missions and a better interoperability within the United Nations. I know the United Nations, and within the United Nations, many leaders are trying to do that, but we have to be very transparent about this. We cannot keep asking to local staff duties and tasks that they cannot face because they are already overcommitted on other aspects. So I'll stop on this clear, I think, policy that I think could help transition, but not only transition, the effectiveness of peace operation.
Thank you so much to the whole complete panel for your participation and your pertinent answers to some questions that both I and others posed today. We started a little bit late, but I will still try to finish very, very shortly. So this leads us to the end of this seminar. I will not try to conclude here because we don't neither have the time or probably the energy at the moment. But I just wanted to again use this opportunity to thank the Folke Bernadotte Academy and the Swedish Defence University for committing this research brief series, which we are today having the first brief out. And as I said, please get it and read it. I also wanted to thank the FCDO and the Oxford University for organizing this event today. And I would like to reassure you all in here and all who are with us virtually that the Challenges Forum will continue to work on these issues, and we are looking forward to much more collaboration going forward. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.